Hello, this is Brian Ventrudo, publisher of One-Minute Astronomer. Today in the art of stargazing, we're going to take a slight detour from purely astronomical subjects to discuss digital photography and imaging. And specifically, we're going to look at a genre of photography that combines astrophotography with elements of landscape photography as a way to produce some quite stunning images of the Earth and sky at night. Today I'm joined by one of the best practitioners of this art form, Mr. David Kingham. For the past few years, David's been taking up this kind of imaging with a passion and has created dozens of quite moving images. He also teaches this type of night photography in live workshops held in some of the most beautiful locations in the American West. His work is displayed in corporate and healthcare institutions and even in the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. I'm showing some of his work here so you get an idea of what he does. And you can see more at his website, davidkinghamphotography.com. So David is going to guide us through the basics of this type of photography, from equipment selection and also to composition, and a little bit about post-processing. Afterwards, you'll know how to select the right tools, and you'll have enough to start taking basic night photography images that, if not world-class, at least have a little flair. And I'm not much of an imager, so David has his work cut out for him today. David, hello, and thanks for taking time to speak with us today and show us the ropes of this quite amazing field of digital imaging.
Hi, Brian.
So let's start. Just to orient us here, can you say a few words about your background and how you became a professional photographer?
Sure. So I came from an architectural background, which I enjoyed for a long time, but eventually I had to escape the cubicle walls in the corporate world. And about 5 years ago, I got my first DSLR, and I quickly became enamored with it. I spent every free moment I had learning all I could about photography, and I just became an obsessive learner. And I've been full-time for the past 2 years and just been slowly growing my business over this time and really enjoying every moment of it.
Yeah, it certainly shows in your work. So you've got a wide range of work, but you seem to be focusing especially on something that, for the purposes of this call anyway, I'll call night photography.
hmm
And just for the listeners, can you define what you mean, at least, by night photography as you practice it?
So this style, I actually call this nightscape photography,
Okay.
and it's a blend of landscape and astrophotography. It takes the fundamentals of landscape photography, of like using foreground elements to really create a compelling composition, and it takes the parts of astrophotography, of the sky, obviously, but in astrophotography, you're on a guided mount that tracks the Earth's rotation. And with nightscape photography, you're locked down to a stationary tripod so that the foreground and the stars are sharp. And on a tracked mount, the foreground will blur if you include it. So that's kind of the real fundamentals of how they're different. The way nightscape photography is different from both of these is that we're going to use very high ISOs and a wide open aperture to collect as much light as possible.
Okay, so this is unguided.
Right.
Okay. Um, and what draws you to this type of photography rather than astrophotography? Is it the composition or the technical challenge, or?
Well, I love astrophotography in its own right, and I'd really like to do some of this myself. But my real love is for creating an image that connects the viewer with our reality here on Earth and what we can see without the aid of a telescope. So I want to create something that will really connect with the viewer and inspire them to go out and look at the sky for themselves.
Yeah, your images do seem to do that. I mean, astrophotography, the best images are beautiful, but they're quite abstract, and you feel really that you're disconnected from the Earth. Yours have quite a different effect.
Thank you.
Do you have a background as a stargazer at all, or are you coming at this from the photography end?
Nothing real specific. I've, been looking at the stars. I grew up in Colorado. We had very nice dark skies in the mountains. So I grew up looking at the stars, but never really understanding a lot about them. So it's really been a learning process for me too. The photography really inspired me to learn a lot more about it. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get other people into as well.
Do you pick it up as you go? Do you know your constellations yet?
Uh, I'm learning more and more all the time.
Yeah, I can't help but pick them out of your pictures whenever I see them, as a test. It's hard in a dark sky to pick the constellations out because there are so many stars and people aren't used to that.
Right, right.
So let's get into hardware here. So it's one can guess maybe by looking at your work that this is not something you can do with an iPhone.
Right.
What kind of cameras do you need to do this sort of work?
So really to create really high quality images, a DSLR is required and some specific ones in that. The key to this style of photography is gathering as much light as possible, like I mentioned before. And we're having to do it in a relatively short amount of time since we're not on a tracked mount. So this requires cameras capable of extremely high ISOs of at least 3200. And the best quality is going to come from a full frame sensor. And of course, these are the more expensive cameras, but it's really what you need to get the best quality possible.
So the cameras with the bigger chips, which means more money, I guess.
Right.
So, and is the issue with the full frame sensor, it gives you a wider field with a
Mhm.
lens. Is that the main advantage?
No, really the main advantage is based on the pixel density. Since your pixels are more, or the sensors on the site, or the sites on the sensor are spread out more over a larger area, they're capable of capturing more light without adding noise to your image.
Okay, so they're more each pixel is more sensitive than a smaller crop sensor camera.
Right, right.
Okay, so a camera, even so, I've got a camera that can go up to 3200 ISO, but it would likely be it's a cropped sensor camera.
Mhm.
But you're saying it would be noisier at the same ISO than a full sensor.
Right, and that's all relative. It might be okay for some purposes, especially if you're just learning. It's a good place to start. You'll still get a decent image. It's just not going to be high enough quality to print and put on your wall.
Right. Okay. Um, so I wonder because these fast cameras they're relatively new. Is it fair to say that this kind of nightscape photography is it a new type of photography enabled by camera technology itself? Like, is this something you could have done 5 or 10 or 15 years ago?
It really started getting to a really good level of quality about 5 years ago, and before that, some of the digital camos were starting to get into it. But yeah, before that, sensor technology just wasn't there, and then before that, film never got to that level where you could go to a high enough ISO, especially with the reciprocity failure. It just wasn't possible.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very new.
Yeah, I remember trying the old days, as it were, 3200
Hmm.
ISO black and white film, and it was pretty grainy.
Right, right.
Um, okay, so full sensor cameras. Can you tell us just a few models to get us oriented that work? Recent,
Sure.
over the last couple of years that have been released.
Yeah, and this is going to be changing all the time.
Yeah.
Pretty much any new camera that's coming out is going to be a good option. So right now, the uh, the two best options, in my opinion, for that are relatively low price are the Canon 6D and the Nikon D610. They're between $1,500 and $2,000.
And that's for
Uh,
the body only, I guess, right?
right,
Yeah.
right. But you can also consider some older bodies like the Nikon D700 or the Canon 5D Mark II. And then for an even lower priced option, you can go with a crop sensor. Like right now, the Nikon D7100 or the Canon 7D are pretty good options. They're getting close to the quality of full frame, but there's still a significant difference.
Okay. And those bodies are what kind of 1,000 to 1,200 or so?
Yeah, right around there, I think.
Okay. And so you mentioned Nikon and Canon. That's a
Mm.
the age-old debate, does it matter? Because
Right.
a lot of astrophotographers with DSLRs will say Nikon's the way, or Canon's the way to go. But
Hmm.
in this, does it matter?
No, I'd say in general it doesn't matter. I just made the switch to myself from Nikon to Canon, but it's not a big difference. I only made it because it's what I do for a living, and I have to have the best quality possible.
Right, right.
But no, overall it doesn't matter. And there's other brands that work not as well, but Sony is starting to come out with some that are capable. Um, that's all I can think of right now. But
Okay, okay. And then, of course, so we're talking bodies only, and so we need a lens also. And you mentioned speed being a critical factor,
right,
both in ISO. So I assume it's important to have a fast lens also.
yeah. So the real important things for lenses are you need a wide angle lens, somewhere between 14 millimeters and 35 millimeters. That's on a full frame sensor.
Okay,
If you're on a crop sensor, you want between like 10 and I don't know, 20, somewhere in that range.
to get the
And then
same field, I guess, same
right,
field of
right,
view. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then yeah, you want an aperture of at least 2.8 and preferably down to 1.4. So
Wow.
you're letting in as much light as you possibly can.
Okay. Now, again, I'm not an expert imager, but fast and wide angle lenses tend to be expensive.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is another 1,000 to 2,000 on top of a camera body for these, or are there lower cost alternatives now?
Well, there is some good news there, and there's a third party manufacturer that makes extremely good lenses for a fraction of the price. And these are made by a company called Rokinon. They sometimes go by Samyang or Bauer as well. They're all the same thing. These are fully manual lenses. So they're manual focus, manual aperture, but this really has no effect on night photography because we're going to be manually focusing anyway and moving very slowly and methodically. But the great thing about these lenses is they're free from a lens aberration called coma, and this causes the stars on the edge of the frame to kind of have like these wing-looking streaks on them.
Yeah,
Really looks terrible.
yeah. I've got a 50 millimeter
Hmm.
Nikon lens I use, and it's supposed to go down to f1.8.
Right.
It's $100 lens, and the coma is just atrocious, right?
Yeah.
At the edge of the field.
Yeah. The 50 millimeters are especially bad.
Yeah, yeah. Would they be worse at 35 too, I guess? Is that the lower you
No,
go?
they get better as you go wider generally.
Okay. Okay, so these Rokinons, so I don't know, something in the vicinity of the 30 or 34 millimeters. How much would these go for? And are they available in North America?
Yeah, they vary. Like the 14 millimeter, you can get for about 350. 24 millimeters, a little more. It's about 600. And 35 millimeter, you can sometimes pick up for 350 or $400.
Okay. And a 24 millimeter, say, I mean, not to put you on the spot, but what kind of angular field can you get with that with a full sensor camera?
Ooh,
Approximately. I would like we're looking at 60, 80, 70 degrees here or something.
I don't remember offhand.
Okay, that's something that we can look up. Not a
Yeah.
problem. Um, all right. Okay, so we've got a camera and we've got some ideas of lenses here.
Hmm.
I guess the question is, what what do we give up if we have a camera that can't quite go up to high ISO, or a lens that can't quite get down to f2.8 or f1.8? Is the issue that the stars, obviously we need a longer exposure, and is the problem that the stars are going to start drifting by? Is that the issue?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, our biggest limitation is definitely with the movement of the stars since we're not on a tracked mount.
Okay. And as you mentioned, if we try to track, then the foreground
Exactly.
gets streaked. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, normally you would just go with a longer exposure to collect more light. But since we can't do that, we have to use these really high ISOs and big apertures to collect more light in that way.
Okay. All right. And these lenses are not necessarily made just for night photography, right? These could be used for portraiture and landscapes and whatnot.
Yeah, they actually work incredibly well for that, as
Yeah.
long as you are willing to deal with the manual focus.
Right. Okay. Okay. And then, so what else do we know? I guess obviously a tripod is a must.
Sure. A tripod, you need something that's really solid. We're doing really long exposures, and so your tripod can't move at all in that time. Just any little shake is gonna. So for a tripod, you need something that's really solid. With these long exposures, your tripod can't move at all. So you really don't want to skimp out here. They can get pretty expensive if you get a nice carbon fiber tripod. But you can also find like an old heavy aluminum tripod that is relatively cheap, but it's going to weigh a ton, but it's going to work great for this.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's the trade-off.
Yeah.
And filters? Do you use any filters for this kind of work?
Not really. I just started using a fog filter, which I'm still kind of playing with, but that
That
just kind of
adds a glow to the bright stars. Is that the idea?
right.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing I use ever.
Okay, so let's talk about how you compose these images to make them so striking. And we'll start with an example here, Long's Peak. So here we're looking at a foreground shot at the side of a hill with animal tracks leading off into the distance, and then mountains, and then in the very extreme distance, the constellation Scorpius. So how did you compose this shot?
Yeah, so a lot of planning went into this shot as well. Um, I went to a location that was kind of far back in the Rocky Mountains, and hiking in the middle of winter, or snowshoeing up to this location, and planning it with a barely illuminated moon, which the point of that was to illuminate the foreground just a little bit without washing out the stars. And then I happened upon these footprints. I think it was a coyote. And I got down very low to the prints to really enhance them, to really, the lens really brings them to your attention when you get down low and close to a subject. And so I made the footprints lead you into the scene, so it leads you directly to Long's Peak, which is kind of your mid-ground subject.
Hmm.
And then that complements nicely with Scorpius on the right side, so it all kind of flows together, and nothing leads your eye out of the image.
Yeah, it's quite striking. Now, so you've got like a huge depth of field here, but isn't that hard to do when you've got a fast focal ratio?
Yeah, this one was a challenge. I actually had to take several different images at different focus points and then blend these together in post-production,
Okay, okay,
because I was probably only a foot away from that first pop print.
okay. And just to give us some astronomical perspective here, where is the moon in this shot? Is it right behind you or almost behind you?
No, the moon is just to the left of the frame.
Okay, so it's lighting up the clouds.
Right, right.
Okay.
And we were actually intending to go shoot the Milky Way, which is actually in this shot. You just can't see it through the clouds.
Hmm.
It's kind of arcing over and to the left. This was in early spring. So yeah, the moon is just below the arc of the Milky Way.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's a beautiful image. Let's have a look at one other one here. This is probably something that I would try as a beginner, if not implement so well. It's one called Moulton's Barn. And here you've got a beautiful image of the Milky Way, no clouds here. You've got some auroral or sky glow activity, and a nice barn in the foreground. How did you set this one up?
So this one was fairly straightforward. it's actually a panorama. It's I think about 16 images that I took vertically, and this is going all the way from north to south, so it's covering a large field of view. And I set up the camera directly in line with the barn, and took all of my shots. I made sure to level my tripod very well, so that when I took the shot, all of them would be leveled together, so that when I stitched them, they wouldn't be sloping.
Okay. And the barn is this is just ambient light that lights the barn, or?
No, I actually all I had with me at the time was my little headlamp, and I just set it up to the side on a piece of wood and just let it shine on the barn while I was taking the shots. And I had to, put it down to its lowest setting to get it dim enough.
Okay. Now, from the point of view of a beginner, if I were to happen across this barn and plan a shot,
Hmm.
I may not be so aggressive to stitch images together.
Right.
How would a beginner approach this kind of composition? Say if he wanted a bit of the, or she wanted a bit of the frame or the barn in the foreground or trees.
Mm.
What's the best way to look at this here?
Well, your best bet is to go for just going at the core of the Milky Way. So I would just move to the left of the barn to get it at an angle, and then you'd be including the barn and the Milky Way in the same shot, but just one image.
Okay.
It's really not possible to get this arcing Milky Way without doing a panorama.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is a huge field of view here.
Yeah.
Okay, and then as far as lighting the barn up, is that a trial and error? I guess you'll learn by experience when you need foreground light and when you
Yeah,
don't.
right. Sometimes we can use moonlight if we plan it out very carefully. Um, you only want like around a 25% illuminated moon,
Mhm.
which doesn't happen very often, especially in the right direction. So most of the time, you need to do light painting on your subject, and I like to use flashlights for my light painting, and I use flashlights that have a xenon bulb in them. And this bulb has a very natural color to it. Um, in this particular image, I didn't have it with me, so it's not perfect the way I want it, but it worked out. This was a LED light, which has a much bluer tint to it.
Okay.
And I kind of fixed some of that in post-production, but you can't quite get it to the same as what the xenon bulb looks like. So, and most
And
of the time with light painting, you want to keep the flashlight moving over the subject so you don't get any hot spots.
and light painting is just what it sounds like. It's like you're spray painting with light, I guess, right? Just waving it back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like airbrushing. Think of it
Yeah.
that
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So I'm dying to ask camera settings here.
way.
So for this image, or generally, you've mentioned ISO and lens settings and whatnot. What kind of exposure times are we talking about here to get this sort of thing?
Well, exposure times are very dependent on the focal length of your lens. And the simple way to figure this out is to use what's called the 500 rule. And for that, all you do is take 500, divide it by your focal length, and that's the longest exposure you can take with that lens.
Before you see trailing star trails?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So, like with a 14 millimeter lens, that comes out to like 36 seconds. Cameras are kind of limited without doing anything special to 30 seconds. So, you would typically stick to 30 seconds for that lens. And then, like a 24 millimeter lens is 20 seconds, and so on.
Hmm.
So, the longer you get with your lens, the shorter your exposure times are going to be.
Okay. And I suspect this is very dark sky too, right? Like we're not seeing any light pollution here at all.
Right? Very, very little.
Yeah. I mean, when I try to shoot something in the city, like 5 seconds and it's all over.
Right. That's an important thing to note is if you're shooting somewhere that has more light pollution, you're going to have to lower your ISO down to properly expose it. This is all for dark sky.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Um, okay, so we've got exposure time. Now, you mentioned we need a high, fast ISO here. What kind of numbers are we talking about with these kind of cutting edge cameras that you use?
Yeah, so if you have a newer camera, I would start with ISO 6400, which really sounds crazy to most people that are familiar with just about any other type of photography. It's we're usually shooting like ISO 100. So going up to these extreme ISOs will give some people a lump in their throat at first, but that's really what we need to achieve the results that we want. If you have an older camera, stick with ISO 3200. That's a pretty good place to start. And kind of my baseline settings, or what I call my no-fail setting, is ISO 6400 f2.8 for 20 seconds. Now, if you're ever just stuck and don't know what to do, plug that in, and you're gonna get a decent shot.
So that's the place to start at least, and you can always adjust from there, I guess.
Exactly.
So yeah, these ISOs are a little bit frightening. I guess the idea is that these high quality cameras keep the noise low at such high speeds, right?
Yeah, and it's relatively low. I mean, it's the best we can do with what we have. So I find it to be pretty good results. A lot of people that are used to landscape photography might not find it acceptable, but it's what we have to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you call it your no-fail setting.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about focus. I mean, focus is not that hard in the daytime, but at night when you can't see anything, what kind of strategies do you use to bring this into focus?
Yeah, this is probably my most common question, and it's what people struggle with the most when they start out with night photography. And unfortunately, setting your lens to just infinity doesn't work in most cases. If you're using an extremely wide angle lens, like a 14 millimeter, then you can get away with that. It usually works fine.
It's
But
more forgiving, I guess, is it?
yeah, yeah. But if you're using a 24, 35 millimeter, it doesn't work out. It's just the point of focus you need is too specific. So you need to generally get closer to the hyperfocal length. But what I found the best way to focus is you start out by setting your lens to infinity. That's just a starting point. And then you turn on live view. And if you're not familiar with live view, learn it, love it.
Yeah, yeah. I recently got a camera with live view. It is beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But once you're in live view, you use the zoom buttons on the back of your camera, not zooming your lens, but you zoom in on the brightest star in your sky. And once you find this star, you can just adjust your focus manually until the star is a sharp point of light. And it's going to be more obvious when you're out there, but when you change that focus, you're going to see that star go from a blob of light to this sharp point. And that's really it. Then you take a test shot and zoom in on that resulting shot to make sure it's in focus, and then you just tweak your focus again if necessary.
Okay, and don't bump the camera, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And but how about the foreground? Does it hold focus too when you're focused on the sky?
Well, that is relative to your hyperfocal distance. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's basically when you focus on this certain point, it makes everything in focus from infinity to a certain point in front of your lens. And there's calculators online that help you figure out what this is. So as long as you're on that point, which seems to be pretty much the same point as when the stars are in focus, when you have that, your foreground is going to be in focus and your stars will be in focus, even with that large aperture.
Okay, okay.
But you just have to make sure that you're not too close to your subject.
Right, right. Okay, well that's great. Now, I guess one more thing when it comes to hardware and actually recording the images
Mhm.
is what kind of file format do you recommend for this? Is JPEG okay, or are you crazy not to go with a raw image?
I always shoot in RAW. I don't find that to be optional. I think it's very important. It gives you a lot more flexibility with what you can get out of the file later on, rather than just relying upon your camera to decide for you. Because if you shoot in JPEG, you really can't modify it without destroying the file later on.
Okay, you just lose too much information when it's compressed into a JPEG, or the camera
Yeah,
does? Okay.
yeah,
Okay, so raw images are a lot bigger, but it's really not an option for this kind of working.
yeah. I would say it's extremely important.
Okay, well, memory is cheap these days, so it
Right.
doesn't seem to be an issue. So let's talk a little bit about processing. Now, processing, of course, is an art in itself. Once
hmm
you get home, what are some considerations for processing? Maybe starting with what's a good software package to use with this kind of imaging.
Sure. I really think the best software out there right now is Lightroom. It's relatively low cost. I think around $100. You sometimes get it cheaper, and it's really powerful.
So this is by Adobe, right?
Right, right.
Yep.
And the quality you can get out of the files is something it's just a step above everything else right now. You can pull lots of shadow detail um, out, and the way it handles noise is much more natural. It looks more like film grain.
Okay, which I guess is critical if you're shooting at, ISO 6400.
Yeah, it makes a giant difference.
Okay, how is it different from Photoshop? Is it different from Photo? Is it a subset of Photoshop or?
Well, it's very, I don't know, it's very different from Photoshop in ways and very similar in some ways. Photoshop comes with Adobe Camera Raw, and Adobe Camera Raw is essentially Lightroom, but in a different package.
Okay,
So if you have Photoshop, you can get away with just using Camera Raw. So Lightroom is really just working on the raw files for the most part. So it's kind of intended as that in an organizational tool. It's not for use on like manipulating the actual pixels of the file like Photoshop is.
oh, okay. So, and Lightroom works best or works only with raw files, or can you use it with JPEGs, for your regular snapshots, or?
Yeah, you can use it with JPEGs, and you can still make adjustments on those as well.
Okay, and it's not just for Nightscape photography. Lightroom can be used for
Right.
days. Okay. All right. Now, it's a huge subject, and
hmm
I know you give quite a bit of instruction on this sort of thing, but let's look at a couple of before and after examples of post-processing or processing, and you can just kind of walk through what you've done. We'll start with one called Glacier Gorge.
Okay. So this one is actually quite complex. It's a panorama of I think 18 images.
Oh, I see. So the top images are all separate images that you're going to stitch together?
Right, right.
Okay,
And the one on the right is just one of those frames blown up to show you what the raw file looked like.
gotcha.
And that you can see it wasn't much to start with. It was actually kind of underexposed. This was an early one that I didn't know what I was doing as well. So you can see that you can screw up and still pull lots of information out of the file.
Yeah, that's amazing. So this is the moon we're seeing in this?
Yes.
That's okay. And so this is near the process version is near the center of the finished image, right? And
Yes.
the only difference is just processing in Lightroom here? That's how you extracted all this extra detail?
This one I did some additional work in the Nick suite of products. That's owned by Google now. They're a really nice tool set to use for extracting more detail out of night images.
Okay.
But most of it, the base work was done in Lightroom, and really the most important part is getting your white balance correct. That's what really makes image is really natural looking. Most people get the advice that they should shoot white balance of daylight, and that just does not work for night photos. It's a very warm color. It looks orange.
Right. Oh, and what do you set the white balance in the camera for? Is it a manual or?
Yeah, I set it to a manual number, so you have to go to the Kelvin setting,
Okay,
and I set it manually to 3800.
in the camera.
Yeah,
Okay, and then you tweak it in Lightroom.
right. And you don't have to set it in camera. I just do it because it's more pleasing to my eye, and I'm more likely to continue shooting if I see a good image.
Right, right. Okay. Um, all right. Well, let's look at a simpler one then for pre and post. We'll have
Hmm.
a look at one called Tetons,
Right.
named after the mountains.
Yeah.
And we've got so I guess left is the before.
Right.
Is that the raw image?
Yeah, that's what the raw image looked like. And you can see it's kind of ugly. It's got a really nasty green tint to it.
Right.
And this is fairly typical of most cameras. There's going to be a really green tint. So in Lightroom, you're really going to have to turn up in the light in the white balance setting, turning the tint more towards the magenta side rather than the green side.
Right.
So I generally set that to starting with like plus 10, and that kind of takes away that green haze. But beyond that, I use some more advanced techniques with RGB curves to remove some of the light pollution. And that's kind of hard to explain over a call. But if you look on I have a page on my site for presets, and there's a video that explains how to go through that process on there.
Okay. So you have presets you can actually put into Lightroom, and
Right.
good places to start for us beginners, I guess.
Yeah, it's I've set them up so they're extremely simple to use, and they get you to a very good place without hardly any effort.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
One thing I didn't ask, are these all? I know you've done so you stitch some together, but do
Mhm.
you stack any of these images like astrophotographers do sometimes, or are these
Um,
all single shot?
I don't do any stacking for the skies like astrophotographers do.
Okay.
So I know of some of my friends have got into that, but I haven't got great results. Just mainly because we're dealing with a foreground subject, so it's really hard to deal with that along with the sky.
Yeah, that's just going to get brighter, right? Your foreground.
Right. So you have to actually, if you do that, you have to blend in another shot of your foreground
Hmm.
to get that looking right.
Okay. Well, I guess if you're in dark enough sky, I mean, you're not after faintness here.
Right.
I guess you're after a more a striking image of the brighter stars. You're not going deep,
Exactly.
not going deep here, as they say.
Yeah. And in this image, I used another plugin called Star Spikes, which you might be familiar with.
Oh, to give a little bit of shape to the stars.
Right. I used it in kind of a different method to just give a little bit of glow to the brighter stars.
Okay,
So
so
that,
that's not with a filter. That's with star
yeah,
spikes. Okay.
yeah, that's with Star Spikes. And that really makes those brighter stars stand out so that people can see those constellations more like they're used to.
Hmm.
Because, like you mentioned earlier, that field of stars is not what we're used to looking at because we can't see those faint stars that the camera picks up.
Hmm.
So to me, it's really critical to enhance those.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm just looking at the structure of the Milky Way. It's amazing.
Thank you.
You can see the M24 star cloud right at the top. That little
Right.
rectangular square where you're looking through the dust about 9,000 light years into the galaxy. Just pops right out.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. So these are summer stars here. I guess the Milky Way is just coming. This is a beautiful time to shoot it. Did you do this in the late spring or early summer?
I believe this was around the 4th of July.
Okay. You must be doing a little bit of hiking for this stuff, I guess. This is physically demanding kind of photography.
It can be. This particular image was not. It was a quick little walk out to a bridge.
Okay.
But a lot of it, like you could bring up the Cupid Mountain shot. That was an extreme example of snowshoeing in, I think it was in March in the Rocky Mountains, and we were up at 13,000 feet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is really extreme in the winter. Insane winds that just freeze you, and I thought I was going to lose some toes and fingers on that trip.
This stuff would look good with palm trees in the foreground too,
Yeah, it's a possibility.
That's a beautiful, beautiful shot, though.
Thank you.
All right, well, this gives us a taste for nightscape photography. If someone wanted to learn more, where can they start? You've got a blog and you've got some tutorials. Is that for experts, or is there some information for beginners there?
No, there's a lot of good information for beginners on my blog. There's things like 10 steps to photograph the Milky Way that just kind of give you the basic things you need to know so you could print that out and take it with you in the field. But I've got lots of information on there from beginner to advanced, and I
Uh,
also,
Equipment reviews too, I've noticed.
yeah, I do a lot of equipment reviews so you can figure out exactly what you want, so you're not just guessing like I did in the beginning.
Yeah, that can be an expensive guess, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And you also lead like field workshops in the beginning of the year, right? I guess they tend to happen in late winter and early spring. I've noticed you've got a whole series of them on your website.
Yeah, I actually have them throughout the year. The earliest ones in February, and the latest ones in October, I think. So
Oh,
yeah, I teach various workshops in different national parks throughout the country, and we spend 2 days in the classroom learning all these things in a lot more detail, and then we spend 3 nights out in the field just taking photos at different locations and having a great time.
very cool. And this is big groups or small groups of people?
Oh, they're very small groups. I limit them to 6 people to make sure everyone gets the attention they deserve.
Okay. And so you're camping out there, or you're set up in cabins in the park through the Park Service, or?
We're just set up in hotels in nearby cities so we can have a place to go back to and rest, and then have our classroom space to do our learning during the day.
Okay. All right. So that's all laid out at your website again, davidkinghamphotography.com.
Yep.
Excellent. All right. Well, David, thanks very much for introducing us to this subject. It's just a beautiful type of image to look at, and it does really evoke an emotional response, even for a hardcore optical techie like me. I really,
That's great to hear.
yeah, I really enjoy looking at your work.
Well, thank you.
Um, Great. So again, it's David's works at davidkinghamphotography.com. So have a look at what he does over there in his tutorials, and that's a great place to start this lovely pastime. Thanks again, David.
Great. Thank you, Brian.
Bye.
Take care.